Okay, welcome everybody. I think we're going to make a start now. We may have a few other people joining us. I'd like to welcome you all to ODI for our morning sessions where we'll be talking about anti-discrimination measures, a path out of poverty. My name is Anna Mday. I'm a research fellow with the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network and the social development teams. I haven't been with ODI very long, but this is the first piece of work that I got involved with when joining ODI. And it came out of a background of work on the chronic poverty reports that CPAN, the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network, have produced over a number of years, looking at different dimensions of chronic poverty. And one of the realisations from that work is around how discrimination, social discrimination, legal discrimination, discrimination of many varieties, maintains and reproduces poverty, material poverty, and fundamentally denies people opportunities to access resources, to take opportunities in education, and in so many different fronts. So this piece of research set out to look at the evidence base on anti-discrimination measures. We'll be talking about the details of that piece of research later on this afternoon in the second session. But in this first session, we have three speakers who are going to talk about different aspects of discrimination and anti-discrimination, talking about things like categories of person, categories of discrimination, and the complexity of some of those issues. This is not an easy area to research because the definitions of what we're looking at can be quite slippery and difficult to get hold of. And anti-discrimination is far more than passing a piece of legislation at a particularly targeted group. And one of the key issues that comes out of our research is the difficulties of implementing change, of implementing social change, of implementing legal change, and shifting patterns and structures of discrimination. So I'll first introduce our three speakers. They'll talk for around 10 minutes each. And we'll then have an opportunity for some question and answers. So our first speaker is Sarah Hussain, who's on the video link here. Can you give her a wave? I know she can only see us here. She can't see the audience there. So thank you, Sarah, for joining us. Sarah is the Honorary Executive Director of the Bangladesh Legal Aid and Services Trust. She's also a barrister practicing in the Supreme Court of Bangladesh, mainly in the areas of constitutional, public interest and family law. She's a partner at the law firm of Dr. Kamal Hussain and Associates, and currently serves pro bono as the Honorary Executive Director of the Bangladesh Legal Aid and Services Trust. She's does casework on women's rights, including public interest litigation before the Supreme Court of Bangladesh, challenging things like fatwa violence, forced veiling, virginity tests as medical evidence. So Sarah will be talking about some of her work with you this morning. We're then going to have Dr. Jelke Burston, whose biography I should know off by heart because Jelke and I have worked together over a number of years. Jelke is currently a reader in gender and development at King's College in London. She teaches gender development and social policy. She's worked broadly on violence against women in Latin America and published several books on sexual violence in war and peacetime Peru. Jelke and I have also worked together on people living with HIV/AIDS in Sub-Saharan Africa, specifically Tanzania and South Africa, looking at rights and discrimination and patterns of engagement and how civil society work to try and reduce stigmatisation. We then have Alex Coate, who is the Capacity Building Programme Manager for the International Disability Alliance. Alex holds an MSc in International Development. He's been working in the field of inclusive development for 20 years and has worked with Handicap International in East and Horn of Africa, Regional Programme Director in South East Europe, and then in the Middle East. He's managed programmes in the field of social services, humanitarian relief, medical rehabilitation, civil society development and policy advocacy. He recently participated in the negotiation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So we've got an extremely knowledgeable set of speakers to start with, to give us their insights. I'd really like to thank them all. Sarah for taking time out of her schedule in Germany to be with us, and Alex and Jelka for stepping up the programme at the very last minute, so it's really appreciated. So we're going to hand over first to Sarah.
Great, thanks a lot. Can I just check whether you've received my presentation or not, because it might be easier to put it up.
We didn't, I'm afraid.
If you ask Stephanie, she's got it in her email. If she can put it up, that would be good. But anyway, I'll start in any case.
Yeah, I'm afraid we might not be able to get that. Is it okay
well, you
for you
could
to
give
continue?
It to people yes, obviously, yes.
Yes,
but
thank
you can
you.
give it to people afterwards, I think.
Yeah.
Well, first I'd like to thank the speaker, thank the researchers who've put this together, because I think they've looked at something that was long overdue, really needed to be looked at, and sort of starting to look not at what they mentioned, they found many studies on, which is the obstacles, the challenges, the areas where discrimination exists, and the kind of work that's been done to put in place standards to address that, to put in place measures, provisions that would ensure equality, but actually then looking at the next step. I think that's obviously a really important thing to do. I think also the four issues that they identify that they see as necessary to combat discrimination: legal change plus attitude changes, plus other measures, programmatic measures like reservations or quotas or service provision, and then finally financial support. I think that's also quite a helpful kind of approach to understand what's been done. And the three areas they've looked at are also significant around political participation, education, and labor markets. So it's a really important beginning. What I thought was interesting also to maybe highlight is what some of the limitations were and what's been left out. So the fact that they looked only at policies and programs operating at scale, I think is a pretty significant limitation, because of course many of the critical actors in this work of trying to address discrimination and inequality are from civil society and are often operating pilot programs, smaller programs, projects through which they're making change happen. And none of that has been reflected at all. I'm sure there are methodological reasons, but I think it means there's an enormous area of absolutely critical information that's completely absent. Secondly, the choice of languages, the fact that English, French, and Spanish are used, and none of the languages, even where they're national languages of the countries that have been looked at, I think again leaves out an enormous amount of critically important information. And where it's identifying evidence gaps, it means there aren't necessarily evidence gaps. It's just the researchers haven't built into their study the fact that they need to look across and beyond these languages. And online access is another issue. A huge amount of publications, particularly in the NGO field, particularly outside the West or outside the North, are not immediately produced for web access and sophisticated video online conferences. So I think you need to also look into that and see how you go beyond a bit. Another issue, I think, was, again, in terms of the sources of information. The researchers mentioned that there are particular groups that they really could get very little information on. Migrants, displaced, religious minorities, indigenous peoples, and then sexual minorities, so anyone affected by discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, that may be reflective of the fact there isn't an awful lot going on in any case in terms of inclusion, or it may be just that they couldn't find the information and the research on that. I think that clearly needs to be looked at more. Another couple of areas that I think I didn't see in the study, and I thought that was interesting that they were omitted, and I wondered if there were reasons for that. One was really around seeing the source of law as being in judgments, and so the role of Supreme Courts in handing down final judgments. So when you mention law, you don't kind of clarify what I took it as assumed that you meant statutory law. You weren't really dealing with judgments, but I think that's a massive omission, particularly for countries where, for any common law country, but also for countries where strategic litigation has become really important as a source of standard setting. And another institution that I think could have maybe their products could have been looked at a bit more, is around national human rights institutions and their practice, and in terms of addressing discrimination, whether they're implementing decisions coming out of courts or implementing their own guidelines and directives. And a final area, a final gap, I thought, was around looking at laws that don't just deal with creating different kinds of opportunities and remedies, but laws that deal with punitive provisions, so that actually, criminalize certain forms of discrimination, and whether those actually have had an impact in terms of empowerment, in terms of, whether the ability to be free from certain forms of violence or discriminatory behavior, whether that is actually, it's a very, very difficult, I think, to show the causality, to work out how you would demonstrate the impact. But again, that would be something maybe to add in. Okay, so yeah, a big question I had, another sort of point to appreciate, I think, is that you really put out there very clearly that you're looking at not only different grounds of discrimination, but also intersectional discrimination. And again, highlighting how little work there is in looking at that and looking at the impact of that. And also that you look at the different layers and the depth of the problem. So I think you identified that extreme multidimensional and intergenerational poverty is being addressed. But having said that, I found quite often some of the conclusions that were being drawn seem to be more about a purely material form of poverty and purely economic sort of metrics, and not so much about other social indicators. And maybe that could have been extrapolated or teased out a bit more. Yeah, and there were a couple of points I just wanted to make about maybe the links between international human rights law and national law and the whole focus on addressing discrimination. There's a comment in the paper that says that ratification of international treaties or adoption of constitutional provisions is largely a response to donor pressure, social movements, and governments' desire to appear progressive. I'm not a huge champion of the government side of the world as opposed to civil society most of the time. But I think this is a little unfair. And I think we should assume that there are governments that also respond positively to their constituencies and have political commitments which are also about advancing equality. And that, and that there are governments that come into place through massive social political movements and with a huge political mandate to create change. And we really shouldn't underscore that. And in a way, I think that was the biggest piece that I felt that, again, you do flag it up, the researchers do flag it up, but maybe I think it felt it should be much more central, is the whole question of as a whole political economy analysis and a discussion around power, actually, who holds power and how is power being distributed. Again, you refer to it in different points when you talk about how even reservations, for example, can replicate certain or create and then replicate and reinforce divisions between groups. But I think what that misses out is how that is interacting with the political process to enable that to happen. From my perspective as a lawyer, and a lawyer working with the human rights system and with constitutional law, I found the absence of a discussion around justice also quite telling, that to what extent are justice mechanisms and justice processes and the perception of a shift, a perception of something that was never perceived as an injustice, but is now being perceived as an injustice, a perception of something that was seen as the norm and is now seen as wrong and needing redress. How much is that basic understanding and that shift in individual perceptions about one's own self and one's own community, but also the shift in social understanding? How critical is that? And how essential is it that needs to be brought about through processes of justice, which need to be often catalyzed. So looking at that cycle, again, I think there's a lot of hints of this in the paper, where you talk about mobilization, alliance building, capacity building, and how that cycle all works together. But I thought the instrumentalities of it, which is the use of law, the use of courts, the use of other broader justice mechanisms, and then very critically also how these get kind of filtered down to different level, to really community level, with all kinds of bodies that, or not so much bodies really, but structures that have been created, like, for example, the use of paralegals, the use of community organizations that translate, the very highfalutin language of constitutional law judgments into common, simple language information on the ground, how that gets translated. I thought that also could have been looked at more in terms of what the impact of that is. Now, just going on to your key findings. Some of the issues, I'll just go through them very quickly, just give me an idea of how we're doing on time. The first question around, yeah?
It's okay, I think you've got maybe 3 more minutes.
Oh, great, okay, thanks. So the first question on the making of categories as being political, yeah, that's absolutely right, and that they can embed certain forms of difference. But again, they do shift power, and that has to be recognized. That even the question about increasing numbers, changing representations, is it enough? Clearly, it's not enough, but it's an important first step, and that needs to be sort of seen as a useful end in itself to get people, into the position so that they can then make the difference. And the critical difference being their access then to power and their ability to make decisions. And that really links into whether they're functioning in a democratic structure or not, in a democratic process or not. Issues around, let me go on a little bit to some of the evidence gaps and things that I think be addressed. A historical analysis, I think, point to that different kinds of analysis that might be brought to bear in terms of the context for national legislatures and political representation in national bodies and in local bodies. So I think we're trying to think about studies that would look at the impact at local level of quotas and reservations in terms of political participation might yield us some more substantive results about possible impact. Looking at talking about the role of politics and needing an analysis around that, I think if we're talking about, when we talk about discrimination equality, we have to look very hard at the role of religious institutions and at the role, particularly, even more true every single day at the moment, of the role of fundamentalist politics across religions. So what is the role of the Vatican? What is the role of Muslim extremists? What is the role of powerful Hindu extremist organizations allied to one of the strongest emerging, strongest sort of power blocks in the world at this point, and for us in South Asia very significantly? What is the role of these bodies in holding back the march towards equality? And where are we addressing it? Where is the development agenda even taking on board that these obstacles exist? Is it trying rather feebly to co-opt these kinds of bodies? Is that a remotely successful potential strategy? And should we be addressing that straight up? Going on to looking at just finally a few questions about, let me do a quick point about justice again. I spoke a bit about strategic litigation and, landmark judgments and so on, but I think we also can't underestimate the use of individual litigation as a tool, again, because precedents are set, but also just the reinforcing, just the knowledge that redress is available, and the fact that makes a difference in itself. So looking at that as an outcome, not just as a process, I think would be interesting. And maybe some of the kinds of studies that are beginning to happen, we're doing some work at the minute in Bangladesh with support from DFID, looking at the implementation of public interest judgments. So particularly looking at judgments around right to housing and forced evictions, and where, what impact has it had? How many people has it left safe in their workplaces, able to carry out their livelihoods because of these kinds of decisions? I would see that as an anti-discrimination measure, and the impact would, look at not only their access to shelter, but also access to livelihood as a consequence. Final few questions, I think. Question around right to, you looked at labor force participation and education and political participation. I think looking at shelter and health would be really important. Looking at freedom from violence is another major area. You've talked a lot about feminist organizing, how important that's been. That's obviously been particular areas where there has been a difference made, and again, one needs to look at that. I think the sort of cycle of change is about access to knowledge, mobilization, alliance building, crucially access to services, the presence of services. So not enough actually to have knowledge and mobilization if you can't go there to find somebody who's going to stand up for you and get you protection from where you need it. And then finally, of course, responsiveness of institutional actors and capacity building for them. Some questions that are out there, and I'd like to end with, is, should and which the researchers raise, is, should this be around identity? Is continuing to organize around identity to address the issues of equality and non-discrimination? Can that be a poison chalice? Can you end up, as I said, fragmenting into tinier and tinier groups and losing actually the opportunity for broader solidarity around the principle of equality and social justice as you end up in a sort of contestation for resources and power? And so does it make more sense to talk about coming together across issues? Is it also critical to look at an important variable being the availability of democratic space and space for organizing? And that links to my final point. How do we look at the key actors here? The researchers mentioned throughout the paper pretty much that they were not able to look at, they found it as a significant gap, the impact of civil society and civil society mobilization. I would completely agree with them. And I think the absence of that, the absence of studies around that, so not simply NGOs, but other social movements, trade unions. Importantly, we're talking around the issues of equality and discrimination and around using justice mechanisms, the role of professional associations, so pro bono lawyering in our case, for example, even universities, university law clinics, how do they get involved in these processes? And very, very finally, the link between the role of sort of transnational organizing here, or regional and sub-regional linkages, and what kind of impact that plays. And I'm talking about the sort of processes rather than the outcomes here. But I think looking at those would also be very helpful for some of the results that you're trying to document. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Some really insightful points and lots for us to think further about and how we address some of those. I absolutely agree with your last point about the danger of the fragmentation when we look further and further at particular identity groups. We're going to move on to Jelke now to talk about one of those big identity groups where there's a lot of discussion at the moment and a lot of focus in our report on gender.
Thank you very much. Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation in the first place to come and speak here. I am just, as Sarah is, very happy with the agenda of the Chronic Poverty Network to focus on anti-discrimination in the first place as a tool for reducing patterns of inequality. To a certain extent, it seems like an obvious step to take, but it's nevertheless often neglected in policy and arguably in research, although less so, I'd argue. Now, my field is gender and development, so I will focus my intervention on gender and the broader development agenda. So I won't go into the specifics of the research that you have been doing, as Sarah so eloquently did, but more broadly about the general international development agenda. So if we look at the Millennium Development Goals, they were very much criticized because of their relative conservative agenda with regard to gender issues, as their objectives did not demand changes in fundamental areas such as reproductive health, care regimes, gender-based violence, or respect for sexual preferences. The new goals are much more ambitious, although we do not know what that might mean in practice. Nonetheless, I can tell you what I believe it would be important for the SDGs and following that from the broader international development agenda and how we speak about this, and hence to reduce gender inequality and broader patterns of intersectional discrimination. Now, for a start, I think it's important that we, as researchers and policymakers, broaden our own understanding of what gender is about. So, as we know, because of different assumptions about gender, poverty affects women and men differently. And we perceive those differentiated effects also on employment, political participation, health, education, consumption, credit opportunities, but also, and less obvious perhaps, sustainable energy or water pollution or the melting of glaciers and on citizen security. Now, I won't go into the details, and I'm sure that you all are aware of these differentiated effects of the major themes of our contemporary times. But if we aim for a global society where all of us can live in dignity and equity, then we have to actively foster opportunities and inclusion beyond addressing everyday discrimination. So I'm making a link between, on the one hand, anti-discrimination, and on the other hand, actively fostering opportunities for people around the world. So, of course, there have been successes, and I agree very much with Sarah that, for example, gender quotas and I work mainly on Latin America, gender quotas in politics in Latin America have been really successful in bringing in more women into parliaments and into governments. However, if we look at Latin America, and we know that this is valid for most other parts of the world, including the West or Southeast Asia, violence against women continues to be extremely high. So violence against women in terms of interpersonal, domestic violence is high in Latin America, with women often struggling to get out or stay in abusive relationships, while also caring for children and elderly and holding those jobs that we want them to have. In Latin America, this roughly affects 50% or more of the female population. Likewise, in parts of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, violence against women continues to affect a majority of women. In the West, around 20 to 25% of women are affected by such violence, evening out to about a third of women and girls worldwide experiencing gender-based violence. In addition, trafficking of women and girls is persistent and a very difficult problem, partly because it moves in the shadows of the global economy. In parts of Central America, feminicides, i.e. the killing of women because they're women, are very high. Estimates show that 700 women are killed in Guatemala each year, about 400 to 500 in Honduras, and the Special Commission for Feminicides in Mexico estimates that 2,500 women are murdered each year in Mexico. And then there's the global concern around sexual violence against women in conflict. These high levels of violence in conflict are specifically gendered, and they're possible because of the normative frameworks which allow women to be victimized and sexualized in certain ways. So high levels of sexual violence in conflict, as well as within armed forces, look at the US armed forces, for example, must be strongly related to so-called peacetime normative frameworks in which women can be violated and abused, in great part with impunity. So it's violence that is possible and imaginable. My point here is that violence against women and girls is an indicator of how bad we are doing in terms of gender inequality, despite the minor successes. We can talk about empowerment, school enrollment, political participation, but if violence continues to be high, this is likely to negatively affect women's participation and do little to change harmful normative frameworks that feed into discrimination in daily life. So I'd suggest perhaps we need to become more radical in what we do. So the New Development Agenda includes the idea of equity and dignity for all. The SDGs also contain specific objectives on gender equality and women's empowerment. This is very good. However, to achieve that goal, one ought to be proactive in all the other goals in order to promote women's participation from all social strata. And I think that in the end, what we say about gender is valid for most marginalized groups as well, although in slightly different ways considering context. So we don't have to wait for marginalized individuals to feel and act empowered. We can also actively give power. We can assure that higher education scholarship programs take into account who's able to apply and who gets accepted. Likewise, when suggesting construction of infrastructure or promoting sustainable technology, we can seek the views of those who are often not heard, being more proactive in giving power instead of doing the exercise of empowerment. We could promote an education which takes into consideration young women's need for information on sexuality. and which takes into account that young men must learn about gender dynamics like young women do. That is to say, gender cannot be an aim conceived separately from the other goals, and nor can gender be equal to women, or a women's problem even. Gender must be a perspective integrated into all sustainable development goals and the broader development agenda. Now, until recently, because I know that this sounds familiar, this would have been called gender mainstreaming. But gender mainstreaming has clearly not achieved the objectives of gender equality or even of cross-cutting policy making. Gender mainstreaming in practice very often has meant that there is a gender expert in institutions and agencies who suggested specific policies targeting women, often to empower them, and often from a marginal position within the respective organization, not at all mainstream. So I think that the time has come to give power, to cultivate respect and confidence between men and women, regardless of origin, sexuality, religion, or other factors that could lead to inequality. So an agenda of gender equality has then to be embedded in all development goals, not in the sense of empowering women as a separate species, but with the goal of giving them what they're entitled to, rights and opportunities, as it would be the case with other people. And yet, and that's my main point, we have to work towards the equality and dignity of men and women, as well as for lesbians, gays, trans, and all the others, whom do not identify themselves with the mainstream. It does not suffice to limit gender inequality work to working with women. If the agenda is not opened up beyond traditional understandings of gender, and including an intersectional perspective, I'd say, and hence an agenda that is strongly related to women as those who are poorest, victimized, vulnerable, in need of protection, then actually we're not breaking the assumptions and the stereotypes. So we need to redefine the mainstream. I'd suggest we need to be more feminist in our research, and the term feminism is not very popular nowadays, neither in Latin America or elsewhere, bar Canada, of course, and maybe Sweden. Only small groups dare to declare themselves as feminists. But within the international development agenda, we could support those groups in having that feminist understanding. As feminism is, of course, the understanding that everyone, men, women, and all other identities, have the same rights, deserve the same opportunities, the same participation, security, and dignity. So this means that the aim of our actions cannot be focused only on women in developing countries. It has to take into account the structures for cooperation in our own organizations, of global finance, of institutions, of course, of men, of poor men and of privileged men, of men and women in richer and poorer countries, and all people living their lives in or outside gender stereotypes. So I'd suggest that we need to broaden our conception of what gender is and what sexuality is and what it does to people in daily lives. Showing respect and recognizing equal rights of people who live in a different way from the old conventional masculine and feminine roles, stereotypes which limit what we can be as human beings, is strongly related to the gender equality issue. So sexuality and how we live our sexuality is essential. So I hope I've made my argument clear. Such a point of view has consequences for all the other themes within the SDG agenda and the broader development agenda. We need to unsettle and question gender stereotypes and their associated roles to break with the great social, political, and economic inequalities and discriminations that we face. So lastly, how do we do that faced with a policy environment that demands quantifiable evidence and measurable results? I would personally favor a policy which leaves the measuring and the quantifying to different entities that are capable of tracing long-term developments and change instead of focusing on short-term program results. We could favor an emphasis on process and look at process, the process of convincing major stakeholders of the justice of providing women and men with appropriate reproductive health, access to birth control measures, on the process of tracking, tracing, and combating trafficking in women and girls, and on the process of providing justice at the different levels of judicial systems, local, national, and international. These are interlinked. Likewise, I do not believe that access to education itself is a panacea if sexual violence in schools and universities continues to be the norm, or at least widespread. Likewise, I do not believe that microfinance or improved employment conditions or better legislations or quotas in themselves can change the world, in themselves and on themselves. They're linked, they have to come together. They can contribute to a fairer and more equal society in which all can live in dignity and without fear if we set our aims and ambitions high. So, to conclude, I strongly believe that by setting the aims and ambitions high of the international development agenda, instead of waiting for incremental, small-scale social change that we want to measure and put into boxes of evidence, that doing so will support local organizations and communities in their quest for a more equal society. As Sarah mentioned before, I strongly believe that helping such local organizations and communities and alliances is we can largely do that by setting our ambitions and aims high. I look forward to your thoughts on that. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jelka. Some very stimulating and a call to action, for more radical action. So I think it'd be interesting to hear responses to that following. We'll move on quickly to Alex so that we leave some time to get some responses afterwards. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, ODI, for inviting us to share. I just want to say that whatever I say is not the official view of the International Disability Alliance. I work for a membership-based organization where politics matters, so that's an important disclaimer. And I really would like that I subscribe to most of the point that Sarah was saying, made at the beginning with regards to the research, with regards to the positive, but also some of the limitation. I think that when we talk about non-discrimination, the legal aspect and the judicial aspect is extremely important. I think like the whole issue around strategic litigation should have been looked more, how the judicial is actually interpreting non-discrimination. And it's certainly in the field of disability something that is moving. So I will try to bring to you a practitioner perspective. In the last 6 years with IDA, we have been involved in training organization of people with disabilities in more than 60 countries from all regions on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which aim basically promoting a shift of paradigm, and non-discrimination and equality is at the core of it. I just wanted to begin with one element around the lack of evidence, because it clearly come out one more time, I would say. If you want to be clever when you talk about disability, the first thing you say is there is no data, or there is a lack of data. And I think this is true for this work, this is true for the SDG discussion, but it's changing. And I think we will see in the next few years a wealth of data that will really clearly make the case about inequalities, and I think it's important. One point also, which I think is important in such research, is to talk about data politics. What are the data that are actually produced by government, by statistical institutions that allow you to see discrimination or not and measure discrimination? If you don't produce the data, then you cannot be held accountable for that. And I think this is an element linked to that. If just making a point with regards to the SDGs and the whole discussion on indicators, if we talk about discrimination, I think it's very important to have differentiated milestones. If you look at education of children with disabilities, what are the milestones that states will put for themselves with regards to education of children with disabilities? The starting point is not the same than for other groups, and I think this is a very important element. Why don't we have data? Also because researchers didn't care so much until now. I just throw the ball. Disability, when we were working on the World Report on Disability with WHO years back, their low and middle income country and disability was nearly empty. So maybe a lot of development practitioners or researchers are not so interested on person with disability. It's changing. And I think that a lot of the work that ODI is doing now is actually a good sign and will send a positive signal. But as Sarah was saying, one of the biggest problems we have is there is no policies. Most low and middle income countries don't have actual policies for equality and non-discrimination with regards to persons with disabilities. And when they do, there is no budget allocated to enforce those things. We have looked at budget allocation with regards to implementation of policies in many countries, and if you look at low and middle income countries, it's 0.01% of the GDP versus a minimum of 1.2, 1.5 in OECD countries. So it tells a lot. And if there are policies that are enforced, they are usually not rooted in non-discrimination and equality, but further on a kind of protection, medical welfare approach. But it's changing. And I think this, again, the implementation of the convention has triggered in many, many countries legislative change. And I will come to that, but it's too soon for those legislative change to produce outcomes that researchers would then evidence. So if you were doing this job in 5 years from now, you would probably get at least more visibility of the issues or more things to say. But I think one of the big issue is what is non-discrimination when we talk about disability. And in the work we have done with both organizations of persons with disability and interaction with the government, we really see that people actually do not understand what is non-discrimination when it comes to persons with disability. Again, something that Sarah said, which I think is very true, is for many persons with disability, they are not discriminated. They just can't do. And for many governments, the fact that children with disability are not in school is not a discrimination. They just can't go to school. And again, it is changing, and I think the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability is changing a lot, and the signal sent by the No One Left Behind element of SDG is clearly signaling something. But we see how much people are struggling with this. They don't even know where to begin, and I will come back to that. But I think one of the elements in this research, which is before looking at what is done to reach substantive equality, like affirmative action, we could look at what is done to prevent discrimination. And I think when we look at persons with disabilities, there are massive systems that are actually discriminating and blocking people. I just would like to tackle a few of them, like legal capacity. In many countries, actually most countries in the world, if you are deemed of unsound mind, person with mental health issues, intellectual disabilities, you might be deprived of legal capacity. So you cannot sign a contract, you cannot go to court, you cannot open a bank account, etc. You cannot get married. And this in itself is actually destroying any escape of poverty that you could get to reach a certain standard of living and inclusion in society. But many countries, actually most of them, are resisting because they think many people with disability can't make decisions. They are not asking themselves what needs to be in place so that they do and enjoy those rights. And actually, if I look at mental health, it's the big emergency, we are a bit afraid that actually the response that is brought to this emergency is actually not going in the right direction. It's a lot about enforcing mental health legislation, which embed discrimination. I will deprive you of your legal capacity. I will, in last resort, allow forced treatment, whether in a psychiatric institution or in your community, in your own home. And it's normal. And actually, everything thinks it's great. Actually, it's not. This is the embodiment of discrimination and deprivation of civil and political rights. And I think this, still for persons with disability, what is discrimination? And the extent of discrimination is something that is widely still misunderstood. Much better than 10 years ago, but not yet there. Also, when we talk about education, so we talk about inclusive education, but still in many countries, there is this idea, very persistent, including in the UK and in Europe, that some children with disability can't really go to school or can't really go in school with others. We will have special schools and we will have segregated systems, which is again the embodiment of discrimination. Denial of access to justice is also something that we could talk about. So all those elements are really great barriers to escape from poverty. So before you put quota or you assess if quota are actually working, look at all the things that will actually prevent anybody to even use the quota. because you didn't make it to school, you cannot even sign a contract for employment, etc., etc. One of the elements that I think with regards to education is interesting to look at is zero rejection policies. The fact that you cannot, as a headmaster, say to a kid, whatever his disability, whatever his background, sorry, we can't have you in this school. And we believe in zero rejection policy as a tool for parents to enforce themselves also non-discrimination. And I think to look a little bit more at evidence and how those kind of policies can help is very important. I will come back to that later with regards to access. But the problem with access to education, if we focus on children, begins much before school. Parents are afraid. Should I send my kids to school? What about bullying? You were talking about sexual violence for girls. Yeah, imagine girls with disabilities. What does it mean, etc., etc. So awareness raising for parents, working on safe environment, those are really very important elements. If I look at the discrimination that person with disability can face in their own family, are they participating to decision? Are they sent to school like their siblings? You know, it's really a lot of difficulties. And it's not because parents are bad. It's because they have no clue where to begin and they don't get the support they need. Just to go towards affirmative action, because that was one of the big topic, I think one of the big questions is what's the policy purpose? Why are we doing it? And I can tell you that in most of the training I've done, people did not understand quota as non-discrimination or equality. It was a compensation or social protection measure. It was not something that people would understood as a non-discrimination measure that I can leverage to actually achieve systemic change. And this is, again, something on which we work. I can tell you the number of times people told me, quota is part of equality and non-discrimination. Didn't picture it. So actually, the effect of those policies, if the right holder that's supposed to benefit, actually they don't understand those policies, they will not use them to the full potential. So that's also a very important element. But I would also, as Sarah mentioned, I think quota is also, for many, affirmative action is a point of accountability. For many, movement, DPO movement, disabled people movement are not very strong because of all the discrimination they face. The quota is where there is a target, there is a number, and I can hold the government accountable. And in many countries where you have quota, it becomes the alpha and the omega of the discussion, which is negative in a way because it focuses the debate on a very narrow policy instrument, but in a way is also an empowering element. Of course, we cannot deny the issue of politics of eligibility. The smaller the cake, the tougher the fight. And in the disability movement, it's dramatic because the cake is indeed very small. Also, when we talk about quota, how it's made, and I think in India or other countries, you have this issue of reservation. So you have a quota, X% of the workforce should be disabled person, but they can do only those jobs. So you do an anti-discrimination measure who actually foster discrimination, which is a kind of perpetuating the cycle. I have 2 minutes more. So I just would like to move on to just one point or so. When we talk about non-discrimination, I think we should look also at budget earmarking. Like in some countries, you would say 3% of the budget of any public entities will be dedicated to inclusion of persons with disabilities. It was the case in India at some point. And what we saw in research and study is actually that most of the people, the policymakers, don't have a clue what to do with the 3%. Where do I begin? And this is really a very big point. If you don't know how to address, you don't recognize discrimination and you don't know how to address it, you won't get results that researcher could evidence. Just looking at the broader perspective, when we talk about non-discrimination, we believe it's a very good thing that it's in the SDG and that this leaving no one behind bring this perspective. But we see also, and I think Jelke mentioned that we see also pushback. We see also pushback, and there is a kind of big challenge today with the LGBTI issues, where you would have conservative countries in the UN negotiation, and we say it even in the World Bank safeguard policies, which is quite a big piece, where actually if you say non-discrimination, many countries immediately identify LGBTI. And then case closed, discussion, we don't want to go there. So that's one element which I think is in some country, inequality could be okay. Discrimination, not okay. And I think we need to be quite smart on that, but also look what are the strengths. The other element is, of course, non-discrimination based on category, not only fragment policies, but also can fragment advocacy space. Everybody fight for his own thing. And we believe, or we are a bit shared, or we are of two minds in English, which is non-discrimination versus inclusion. We didn't succeed, and I think, unfortunately, we saw it with the gender goal and the gender movement, who has not been open, and for many valid reasons and strategic reasons, not really open to acknowledge the diversity of women or the gender issues, because they were close to the goal and they didn't want to open up any destruction, and they told us quite clearly. But the issue is, if we want a truly inclusive agenda, if we want inclusive policies that are not just juxtaposition of specific measures and checklists, how do you make this integration? The politics don't go in that direction. Everybody fights for its things. And what kind of framework can we propose? And we don't have the answer, but we do see that governments are struggling. They are struggling to find an answer to those multiple elements of discrimination. Even, and as you said, Sarah, we should give them credit. Some of them really want to tackle it. Mm-hmm. But we do believe that they might face actually policymakers, staff in the ministries don't really know where to begin. So I think it's also an interest, while acknowledging the diversity of the needs, not only of ethnic minorities versus disability versus gender and the intersectionality, but also within groups diversities. So we need to acknowledge those things and address those things, those diversities, but how do we still propose a framework where policymaker can come with a kind of overall answers? And we see there that there is a challenge that altogether we could try to address with the implementation of the SDGs.
Thank you very much, Alex. I think we can give all our speakers some appreciation. Really insightful talks. I appreciate we're running a little over our agenda. Sorry, Stefania, our timings. But we'll move now to maybe a couple of rounds of questions. So I'd like to take maybe groups of 3 questions. So if you could raise your hands, and before you ask your question, if you could identify yourself as well, please. And Stefania will bring a microphone. Who would like to kick us off?